Hi there, I'm Eshaan Mani, president of the iWRITE Youth Club and editor-in-chief of the iWriter magazine. Today, I'm super excited to speak with Ms. Kate Messner in our latest installment of the iWRITE exclusive author series. Ms. Messner has written many books, including Breakout, All the Answers, Capture the Flag, and the popular Ranger in Time series. Her books have been New York Times Notable, Junior Library Guild, IndieBound, and Bank Street College of Education Best Book selections, among many others. And you can follow Ms. Messner at Kate Messner on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
Thank you so much, Eshaan. I'm happy to join you.
All right, let's jump into the interview. So, first off, how did you get into writing, and maybe why did you choose to write for a kid audience?
I have always loved writing ever since I was a kid. I've always written stories and poems, and so that's a very natural thing for me. I think I would be writing whether or not I was publishing. As far as writing for kids, it's interesting. Every once in a while, an adult will ask me, when are you going to write a real book? When are you going to write a book for adults? As if somehow books for kids don't matter as much. And I find it to be just the opposite, as a matter of fact. It's a privilege for me to write for young people. When I think about the books that I read when I was a kid, those were the books that like shaped me, and the books that taught me how I fit into the world and taught me what kind of person I wanted to be, more than anything I've read as an adult. So I think writing for kids is just a huge honor, and I really love it.
That's wonderful. I really do think it's a very interesting space, also because it's probably where the most new content is being churned out, especially fiction, right? Like a lot of these really cool ideas are being birthed as we speak.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we're kind of living in a golden age of books for young people. There's so much variety in terms of not only subject, but genre and structures and format as well.
So, how did your childhood influence your style of writing? You had mentioned that when you were a kid, a lot of the literature that you read was pretty formative for you. So, maybe how did that play a part in who you are today as a writer?
It was, and it's interesting. Sort of my hallmark as a writer is that I write all over the place. I write for all different age groups, and I write about a lot of different things. I have, funny, silly books like the Fergus and Zeke Easy Readers about these two classroom mice who go on field trips, and then I have more serious books about, conservation and nature, and also novels for young readers that tackle some pretty tough subjects. So a little bit of everything, and it's funny. That's how I read when I was growing up too. I read all over the place. Probably my favorite books were by Beverly Cleary, but I also had a real thing for sad books. I loved to cry and cry over a book. And I was also obsessed with nonfiction, especially nonfiction about dangerous animals and natural disasters. So I would have this really interesting library stack with books about, sadness and people dying. And then I would have my fun Beverly Cleary books, and I would have books about sharks and venomous snakes and tornadoes that destroyed everything. And it was an eclectic mix, to be sure. And I think that really shaped my writing as well.
Wow, I'm sure that would have been an interesting library checkout list, huh? You have everything from venomous snakes to Beverly Cleary.
I raised some eyebrows, I'm sure.
So, what's the book that changed your life and why?
The book that changed my life. Honestly, it was Ramona. And it's not so much a book as a series, but
Mhm.
when I read Ramona the Pest, I guess that was the first one, which is one of Beverly Cleary's books. It was the first time I'd ever read about a girl in a novel who seemed like she was just like me, like she was imperfect and kind of clumsy, and and made mistakes and got in trouble sometimes and made messes. We had a lot of books when I was growing up. We had a lot of books about princesses and girls who wanted to be princesses, but not so many books about girls who wanted to get muddy and catch frogs and do things like that. So I think Ramona was really pretty life-changing for me as far as seeing myself in a story. And it's one reason I'm such an advocate today for having lots of different kinds of books featuring lots of different main characters. I think everybody deserves to see themselves in a book that way.
I do think that if kids are able to see themselves in books, especially for kids, I think this is very important that we kind of realize that, hey, we also have a part in this world. There are other people out there like us. And it's actually really empowering to see yourself or a character similar to yourself, played out in a book.
Yeah, I should feel that way too. And I remember reading when I was growing up about, women scientists like, Jane Goodall, and this idea that people can do those things. These are regular people who were curious, just like I was. So I love that. I think, if you can see it, you can be it, right?
Of course. And so, what is your hardest scene to write? Like, what has been your hardest scene to write in all the books that maybe you have, or what is maybe a type of scene to make it a little bit easier on you?
Yeah, I think for me, I am by nature a very optimistic person. And if you're writing any kind of novel with suspense and drama, I think you have to go to some pretty dark places emotionally sometimes. If your character is feeling despair, that's a challenge to write because you really have to get into that emotional mindset. And for me, it means thinking back to a time when I felt that way and really going to that place emotionally. So some of the scenes I think in Breakout and Chirp and The Seventh Wish, which are some of my novels for middle grade readers that deal with some tough topics, those scenes can be kind of emotionally draining because I feel like you really have to go to those places emotionally to write characters that feel real.
Definitely, I do think that it's true, and also for me, I think conflict and resolving conflict are hard things because I always like to make my characters coast through the story, but you do want some level of emotional difficulty and emotional depth to the story, which is always hard for me to include, and it's nice to know that there's someone else out there who also has that
Exactly. I mean,
little.
you love your characters, right? But then you have to
Yes,
make all
yeah.
these terrible things happen to them.
And how do you choose themes for your books? How do you maybe think of what you want to write about?
You know, for me, I know there are probably authors who set out thinking, I'm going to write a book about the power of honesty or something like that. It doesn't work that way for me. I usually have a notion and a voice of a character, and I usually have to write a rough draft of the book to figure out what it is I'm trying to say. My rough draft is very much a discovery draft where I'm just, pouring things out. And then I finish that draft, and that's when I can kind of look back and read it and say, oh, this is what I was getting at. And then I go back and revise and really start to shape those themes, whether it's, uh, you know, um, dealing with acceptance or, wrestling with truth and questions and, all kinds of different themes I've tackled in my books, but I never quite understand what it is I'm tackling until I've worked my way through the story and I can step back from it. And then I say, oh, this is what this was all about. This is why you wanted to tell this story. And then I can go through and shape those things a little bit more in the revision process.
Right, and that actually it's great that it gives me a little bit of a window into your writing process too, right? I guess none of us are truly plotters or pantsers, but kind of knowing that we start out with a rough draft, like a very very rough draft, and then we work from there. And it's okay to not have all your values, all your themes pinned down. Like as soon as you start writing, that's kind of reassuring for young writers like myself to know.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I always start with an outline. And then most days I get my outline out and I write my chapter for the day. And then I look and then I was like, oh, I got to revise this outline. So I revise the outline again. Then I sit down the next day. But I have a very fluid outline when I work, and it's always changing.
And what is a writing mistake that you tend to fall into, maybe, or some? I know you talked about what's tough for you, which is maybe adding in those conflicts, kind of making your characters fall a few times and going to some dark places. But what maybe is something that you find that you sometimes overlook, or that you sometimes might make a mistake on?
I have a tendency to overwrite, which is to say, I will describe every tiny little detail in a scene instead of just the things that are relevant and evocative. It's interesting. Writers have different styles. One of my very good friends, when she writes a rough draft, tends to underwrite. And so she has to go back and add lots of emotion and details later. I have just the opposite. I tend to overwrite. I mean, I have a book called Eye of the Storm, which is a futuristic thriller about these monster storms. And in my original draft for that book, there are these kids walking from one field to another, and it should have taken half a paragraph for them to get there. And literally in my original draft, I had them stepping over every pine cone, and I was like, and then there was some dirt, and then I just, I have a tendency to I have to get myself there mentally, right? So I write it all out, and then I go back knowing that I do this and say, okay, what's really essential here to get from point A to point B? So that's something I always watch for when I'm revising, right? Consolidating those boring drawn out bits so that when you read the book, you don't have to skip over them.
For sure, I do think that pacing is something that's important, and like concision and pacing really make a lot of the books, especially like some action books and adventure books, really enjoyable to read. Is that they have a certain, like a pace to them, right? They go at a certain, they're pretty quick in the way they progress. And I mean, for someone who likes to describe things too, I mean, myself, I love adding all this flowery language. It's kind of like condense it, please, make it shorter. Don't add all of that detail in there, which can sometimes make it, a clunky mess for readers to pour over.
Well, you can always write it the first time and then just,
Sure.
keep the best of it and edit out the rest. That's what I do.
That's definitely a very good strategy. And how do you establish character traits of your protagonists and antagonists? How do you go through that? Is that like, are your protagonists reflections of you in any way? How does that work?
I think there's a little bit of me in every character I write, not only the protagonist, but the antagonist too. I mean, a great way to write an antagonist is to take one of your qualities and kind of supersize it, right, to the point where it's problematic. And so I think that's really interesting to explore. But sure, there's a little bit of me in probably every character I write. I spend a lot of time getting to know characters before I even get started in the book. And then a lot of times I'll find mid draft, I still have some questions about what a character might do in a given situation, and try to make that authentic. I'll often go back to that earlier stage in the writing process and do some more character journaling or brainstorming, or I have an activity I like to do where I'll design my character's bedroom and say, okay,
Oh
what's this
wow.
bedroom look like? What color's the bedspread? What's displayed on the walls? What's hidden in the back of the closet? What's stuffed under the bed? What's in the garbage? And I think if you just sort of snoop around like that, you're snooping around the bedroom, but really you're snooping around your subconscious for those additional details about a character. It can be really illuminating.
That investigative, actually, that little investigative element to it actually reminds me that you worked as a TV news reporter, right? Before?
Yes, yes, that's where my
Does that
news
come from there?
comes
Does that
from.
does that little bit come from your time as a news
Yeah, I
reporter?
think it does. I think just, trying to figure people out and ask a lot of questions and not have preconceived notions, I think is important for characters as well as for, real people we're interviewing.
Definitely, yeah, and that's a really cool exercise. I want to try that out next time. Designing their bedroom is really cool because it's also a very intimate space, right? Like it's very when you enter someone's bedroom, you kind of know like that is their space, and you can tell a lot about the person from that little room.
Right, right. Like I wouldn't go, snooping under a real friend's bed, but when it's a character, you can kind of pull that off.
And what would you say is the toughest part of the publishing process for you when you're in the process of publishing a book? Is it maybe looking at reviews? What would you say is the hardest part?
It can be glacially slow sometimes, to be honest with you, and that can be frustrating. I have picture books that have taken 5 or 6 or even 7 years
Wow.
of editing and illustrating and waiting to come out. And so I'm a person who likes to get things done and check things off my list. So the slow pace of publishing sometimes can be frustrating. And then letting go of a book is something you really have to get used to. You spend years sometimes writing a book, and for all that time those characters just belong to you and that story just belongs to you, and when it's published it's not your story anymore. It belongs to readers, and they have opinions, and some love it and some don't love it, and they all like to tell you. So I feel like that letting go is something. There's a learning curve there, but learning to do that for an author is really important because you really are. The act of publishing is the act of giving this work away to readers, and then it belongs to them, and they get to form all kinds of views and bring all different things to it.
I love that the framing of publishing as an act of generosity, as a sort of donation to readers and to the public is really beautiful. I really like that. And so, if you had to do something differently as a child or a teenager to become a better writer as an adult, would you change anything, or what would you do?
Oh, isn't that an interesting question? So I was a voracious reader, and that I think is always kind of the best thing you can do to be a writer is to read. The more you read, I think the more skills and the more craft strategies you have in your writer's toolbox. So that's something I definitely wouldn't do differently. Um, I guess when I was growing up, I I have a lot more adventures as an adult than I did as a kid. My parents were kind of strict, and so there were not quite as many adventures as I would have liked. I guess if I could change something, it would have been a little bit more freedom when I was growing up. But in general, I certainly had a steady supply of books and things to learn about, which was great.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned that reading is a great way to become a good writer, but do you have any other advice for up and coming authors or young writers on how to really hone your craft? Anything that they can do?
Yeah, other than reading, which is always the first thing I recommend, I always think it's a great idea. I always recommend that folks keep a notebook. And that's something that I do. There's always stuff spilling out of it, right? Things I want to look at and think about and maybe write about. But I think keeping a writer's notebook and just collecting stuff in it, right? Not just book ideas, but anytime you see something that's interesting or beautiful or funny or scary or weird, just collect it in there. Or an interesting little bit of dialogue, somebody says something funny, just collect it. It teaches you to see the world like a writer, I think, and to pay attention to those things. And then even if you're not going to write a book, paying closer attention, I think, is just a really lovely way to go through life. You notice things. Writers notice things that other people miss, and I think that's a pretty great way to live.
Well, yeah, thank you for those tips, and thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been such a pleasure.
You are so welcome. It's been a joy. I really appreciated those thoughtful writer questions.
Thank you. I'm Eshaan Mani, president of the iWRITE Youth Club and editor-in-chief of the iWriter magazine. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and ring the notification bell, and I'll see you next time. Bye!